Yeah, sounds good. So welcome everyone. My name is Andrea Sturzik. I am the director of the Faculty of Education's Research Center. It's called the Center for Educational Research, Collaboration and Development. We call it CERCED, and we are the hosts for this event. And I'm glad to see all of you here, and I will now pass it to Paul.
Great, thanks so much, Andrea. Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Paul Dieterich, and I'm the Associate Director of Communications here at the University of Regina. I'm going to just get us started here. You'll be happy to know I only have 3 slides, including this one, so we'll be very brief to begin with. This is the second in a series of 3 mini workshops on research communications at the U of R. Yeah, I'm still on the right stuff. Last week, we talked a little bit about getting research stories out via various platforms and vehicles, how best to work with our communications team to utilize them. This week, we are talking specifically about engaging with media, and once again, how we can assist in terms of pushing your research stories out to media, engaging with media, responding to media inquiries, acting as a subject matter expert for media when they are looking for people to comment on current issues or specific research matters. If you missed the first one, don't worry about it. We will be re-delivering it down the road at a later date. We're also going to be holding a 3rd session, TBA from Conversation Canada. We'll have them come in and speak to the service that they provide as well. Now, really quickly, before I came to the University of Regina at the beginning of 2019, I had a whole other career at CBC Saskatchewan. Started out as a reporter, moved up to producer. Eventually, I was the managing editor in charge of CBC television, radio, and digital programming, all of the sort of editorial arms of CBC and for 6 years before I left journalism and went into my second career in communications and public relations. I point this out just to illustrate the fact that just like you, the researchers, we are experts in our field as well. So are the people, the rest of the people in our unit, who I'll introduce in a moment. We know traditional media from both sides. We know how journalists work. We know what they're looking for. We know how best to engage with them. Most of the time, it's a bit of an art. It's not always a science, but we can help you get those research stories out through the media, which elevates the profile of your research, your people, your faculty, your research center, and ultimately the reputation of our university overall. And that in turn, of course, attracts the attention of funding agencies, prospective partners, donors, potential students as well. So we do pretty well generally in generating media coverage of the University of Regina's research enterprise on a local and a provincial level. We have good relationships with local media outlets. We're back and forth with them almost on a daily basis. What we don't do quite as well is generate attention at a national level for U of R research enterprise. And that's why our unit, in consultation with the VPR's office, developed a national media research strategy, which we are in the process of implementing. These sessions are actually part of that implementation of that strategy, and includes these objectives. I'm not walking you through the whole strategy, but worth noting, among the national media strategy objectives, increase support to faculty and better facilitate their participation in knowledge dissemination through media, including this training. We're creating an online guide to assist researchers. Elevate the work of researchers who are underrepresented or identify as part of a diverse group. We're devoting space in discourse. We're creating annual callouts for EDI research and researchers. Elevate the profile of the U of R by generating national media attention for our research strengths, health, mental health, climate change, water, living heritage, digital future. And this is all through, all of the media channels, op-eds, Conversation Canada, which leads to media coverage, the website, media relationship building, and social media. and strengthen partnerships by profiling research with student participation, community engagement, and partnerships and collaboration. So my last slide. This is us. Many of you know Krista, have worked with her before. She's our best research communication strategist, as I like to say, because she's our only research communication strategist.
You can just stop after the first part. I hate the second part. Anyway, go on.
Everett Dorma, who's going to be taking over here in a second, is our public relations strategist and primarily works on our media relations. This is me, of course, and then our director, who's not with us today, but Aaron Limaker can assist as well. So you have a research story worth telling, reach out to us and we can assist not just with media, but other forms of storytelling as well. So that's it. Let me take this down. So we've tried to design these sessions to be really informal. They're more of a conversation, a Q&A. We'll have a bit of a conversation here. Everett's going to take over and he's going to speak with Gordon Pennycook. Gordon is actually interesting because he's really, really good at engaging with media. But the funny part is that we actually don't facilitate a lot on his behalf. It's because he's got so much experience dealing with media. He almost has a direct line in most cases. We occasionally will set something up for him, but he doesn't really require our assistance. So I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say today. But I would remind everybody that if you're not quite as comfortable as Gordon dealing with media, that's what we're here for, who we are, and what we do. So I'm going to turn it over to Everett. He's going to have a bit of a conversation, then we'll open it up to a wider Q&A, and I will be around if any of those questions should be directed towards me. All right, Everett.
Well, thanks, Paul. Welcome, everyone. Today, I plan to briefly talk about media relations, introduce and have our conversation with our guest, Dr. Gordon Pennycook, and then open the discussion to questions. So in order to generate media coverage, media relations can help develop and issue news releases, opinion pieces, letters to the editors. We make direct pitches where we pitch a story to a specific reporter or media. We'll hold media events and we'll facilitate media interviews with you as subject matter experts. Media have no obligation to cover our stories. They do it when it is when they believe it is of public interest. Surprisingly enough, not all research may be of interest to all media. So when reaching out to media, we try to describe the research in a way that grabs their attention or that brings out an important point that they feel is of general public interest. So essentially, we're selling your story or your research to the media. When thinking about promoting research to the media, one of the first steps we typically ask researchers to consider is why media and the public would be interested. So with us today is Dr. Gordon Pennycook, Assistant Professor of Behavioral Science with the Hill and Levine Schools of Business. I've asked Gord to participate in this session. As Paul mentioned, he is a researcher who has done a large number of media interviews. He's sought out by national and international media, and he is a subject matter expert. So thank you for agreeing to participate in this presentation today. So Gord, would you mind taking a minute to tell us a bit more about your research and why it attracts media attention?
Great. Well, thanks for having me. It's kind of funny to be center of this thing. Is I honestly don't really know why the research attracts attention. I think it intrinsically. One second. See, that's how I get attention. And by the way, here's the first tip for the media: make sure the dogs, the windows are down for when someone walks by with the dogs. Anyways, I didn't think they were going to bark because I had that closed. Anyways, so I do research on misinformation and decision making. These are things that have broad relevance for society, and a lot of the work I do relates to present in current political events. I've done studies on elections and things related to the COVID misinformation and vaccine uptake and things of that nature. And so that's mostly why I think I get called, is that I just do research that seems to be relevant for what is in the news. And I think it's about as simple as that.
Yeah, I think you're bang on, Gord, that your research is current, it's relevant, newsworthy, misinformation, false news that grabs media attention. You're also very good at doing interviews. You appear relaxed. You describe your research in a way that is interesting and understandable to a general public audience. And I think another key point is you also make time to do interviews. Can you explain a little bit about why you feel it is important to get your research to a general audience via the media?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a few things, actually. I mean, part of the reason, by the way, why I think my work has relevance, for what is going on in the world, is that's just what motivates me to do the work. Is like I want to do work that actually has an impact for people, right? And it's important to remember, and I think this is something that I think is really important, is that our job as a professor is to be educators. And one element of that is, I mean, of course we teach the students, but it doesn't stop at the university, right? The whole point of doing research for me is, you got to try to uncover truths about the world and then tell people about it. It's not just for myself. I mean, to some extent I run studies just because I'm curious about something, but it's, I can't be playing in my own sandbox. And so one part of that is, you publish the paper so that other experts can read it. But one major component of that is making sure that other people know about it. And that's the role the media plays. I mean, to some extent you can write your own popular press articles, and I've done that as well. But I mean, think about it. In many cases, you write an article and it might be read by 100 academics. You talk about the key elements of that article in a news interview. Many more people are going to hear about that, and so that's important. The other thing that is important to keep in mind, at least for my work, is that, and I don't do research on like cures for cancer, right? So I'm a psychologist, and most of my work, the way that it would have an impact, is in people knowing about it, being able to learn from it, and then they might engage differently in the world. So as an example, some of my work relates to people spreading and sharing misinformation on social media. And one of the things that we found in our research is that often people share things that are false or misleading without really having thought about whether it's even accurate. Because they're kind of like, when they're on social media, they're thinking about, when they're going to share something, they're thinking about whether people would like it, or how's it make them look, or whatever. And they haven't even thought, is this true? And so we actually have experiments showing that if you remind people about accuracy, that will decrease the amount of false things that they share. And so when I go on in an interview and talk about this, that's me doing the experiment for the people in the audience, right? That I'm giving them the message that might lead them to not share misinformation. And so there's like a direct, that's not common, I don't think, but that's a particular scenario where I think there's a benefit for me to get the message out. And one final thing I'll add on this is that, I mean, this is also specific to me, but some of my work relates to potential changes in policy, mostly policy for social media companies, how they develop their algorithms, or what kind of messaging they send to people, or whatever. And it's not particularly easy to get policy changed for large companies, but one way to help that move forward is through public opinion. And so part of that we've been writing our own articles to try to convince social media companies to listen to us, but part of that also is just trying to get the word out. And so that's another important element.
Yeah, that's a lot to unpack there, actually. Like, I think the key for me is that you feel your research is important and that it can have an impact on the world, and that's people need to know about it in order for that to happen. So Do you have any specific tips for preparing for media interviews?
Yeah, for sure. I would say the biggest thing is the more you do it, the more you get used to it, and it's not as nerve-wracking. It's no different than anything else, really. I mean, the biggest thing is that, of course, you want to think about what you want to say, and you have to keep in mind, I think this is one of the biggest pitfalls that academics have when trying to communicate what they know to the public, is that you have to simplify and you have to not get bogged down in the details. I mean, the details are often important, but you need to come up with what simple message you can give people. If you're going to give one interview, you can maybe get 1 point across, if you're lucky, right? Maybe 2, I don't know. And Paul might have opinions on that too, but it's, better to be repetitive and simple, without, of course, you don't want to oversimplify so that it's not accurate anymore. You have to make sure that you're accurate. That's a key. But making sure that you simplify and you keep on message. I don't prepare a script when I do these things. And often what happens is that the interview, sometimes what happens for these interviews is that they tell you what they're going to ask you, and then you can kind of think of how you'd answer them. Sometimes that's not the case. It depends on what kind of interview it is. For example, some interviews aren't live. Like I've done a few for Global where I'm basically in a conversation with somebody, with the person, then they take a piece of that and put it into the report. And so in that case, you just have to make sure that you say something that's lucid enough for them to use. But when it's a live interview, then if you have a script, it's going to be very difficult because it might go off script, and then you might get caught with that. So I usually don't use a script when I give talks. I don't use a script either. It's mostly just I think about what I want to say, and then it comes out how it's going to come out. That makes me more comfortable. But I guess that's up to an individual to figure out for themselves.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's a couple of key points that you've made. I think it does get easier the more you do them. So the first few you might be a little nervous, but you'll get better at it. And again, considering the key messages or points that you want to make when preparing for a media interview, we generally recommend that you have 2 or 3 points that you want to make in an interview, and whether the reporter asks a question about them specifically or not, that you work them into your answers. Another tip I would give is that you just anticipate 2 or 3 questions that the media might ask you about your research, and then like Gord said, not prepare a script, but just consider how you'd answer them. And also avoiding technical terms and jargon as much as possible is good. It's not always possible to avoid scientific terms, and if you have to use them, then it's good to try to explain them in non-technical terms, what those terms mean. So why do you think it's sorry?
There's a good comment here I want to just bring up real briefly, is that, so Bonnie mentioned in the chat here that sounds like you're focused on the language that your audience will relate to, not necessarily simplification. I think that's right, although that is, you want to make sure that you use language that people can understand, which is, no acronyms and all that. But also, I think some element of it is, I'm not sure if simplification is the right term, but you have to think about what's the important thing. What is the takeaway from the research? What is the message that people need to know from this? That was what I was kind of trying to get at. Anyways, go ahead.
So I think you've kind of addressed this already, but what I found with you is that you're always fairly open to doing media interviews when you're available. I've sent you several requests that are very short notice, and you somehow managed to make them. Why do you think it's important to be responsive to media inquiries?
That's a great question. So I think, I'm not going to retread territory, but I think we have to keep in mind the importance of the media in the information ecosystem that people are presently involved in. So I mentioned that, we play a role as educators, but so does the media in a very serious sense. That is the information that people are going to use to make choices in their lives come largely through the media, and what we do is usually filtered that in sort of way. So it's important to be responsive to them because they're an important cog in what we're trying to do. It's all the same system, right? And it's important to build relationships with the media and trust, so that they know that you're somebody who can be taken seriously, and that they can go to if they on a short notice. And that's, if you don't do it, then either nobody's going to do it and they won't have an expert there to talk about the thing, or somebody who with maybe not as good credentials or experience might not do it. And so I think it's important to step up when you can.
Yeah, I think you made another key point there, is building that relationship with media. When they come across a researcher who can explain things clearly and make time to do it and are available to do it, they'll often come back to the same researcher, or other media will see them picked up in a report and asked to speak to them as well. With media, you can be pretty safe to assume that they're working to pretty tight deadlines. In particular, broadcast media, radio and television, they're usually working on a story deadline with a couple hours or a day. And so they're looking for somebody who can speak to an issue really on the spot, kind of. And if they don't get us as researchers, they'll go to someone else. And so we, when we're dealing with media requests, we'll send it out to researchers as subject matter experts and ask for them to respond whether or not they can do the interview. We really appreciate it if we get a response back from you guys as quickly as possible. That way, if you can do it, we can set it up. If you can't do it, we can try to track down someone else, or we can even just let the reporter know that unfortunately we don't have anyone that can speak to the issue today. And I appreciate Gordon being quick to respond to my inquiries when he comes out or when they come up. So do you have any other advice on how you discuss your research with reporters?
The only last thing, so relating to this, there's a great question about if someone asks a question that you don't have an answer to. Well, a common tactic is answer a question that you do have the answer to. In many cases, if they're asking a question you don't have the answer to, they're making a mistake. Like, they shouldn't be asked. They probably should be aware that they're asking questions that are within the realm of your expertise. And so that definitely don't just make something up, but you can reframe your response around something that you can speak to. Of course, you can say, if you want, I don't have an answer to that, but it's going to be dead air. So if it's a live interview, then that might be difficult. If it's not a live interview, then it doesn't. You can just, like in the case where they're asking you to have a conversation, they're going to take a clip from that. They ask a question that you don't have a good answer to. You just say, I'm not going to waste your time with an answer to that. Let's just move on to the next one.
Yeah, there's absolutely no harm in saying, like, that's not my area of expertise, and you'll have to talk to someone else about it. But I think you've already mentioned a couple of other points, that using plain language and trying to make it clear to the reporters so that the layperson will understand your area of research or expertise. And I think one thing you do is you're excited and enthusiastic about your research, and that comes across with the media when you're on camera in particular. And I think that makes it interesting for the audience to relate to as well. So on the other hand, not all media interviews go according to plan. Can you describe a negative experience you've had and doing an interview perhaps, and how you dealt with it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I can't really describe a negative experience because it relates to my answer to how I dealt with it. So I've definitely have interviews that probably weren't great. And I think probably most of the time if I were to watch the interview after the fact, I think I could have said something different or better. I don't really like listening to them, frankly. But certainly there are ones that were worse. Certainly at the very start, when I think the very first live interview I gave was in grad school. We did a study on smartphone use. Basically, the research was, so here, I'll maybe explain the research just for the sake of interest. So when you are come across some problem that you might not know the answer to, or maybe let's just take an example. You're at dinner and you can't remember the name of an actor. You could either kind of like work your memory to try to figure out, the movies that she was in or something like that. Or you could look on your phone and Google it, right? You can offload your thinking to your smartphone. What we found is that people who are more reflective and more analytic, who tend to think more about problems like in a lab context, are less likely to offload their thinking to smartphones. And so what happened actually in the media coverage for that one, unfortunately, was that people took it to mean that our phones were making us stupid. that it wasn't that. It was just that people who think in a certain sort of way, they like thinking, so they're going to use their brain instead of the phone. But people who are more intuitive and they like to go with their gut, they don't think about things that much. They don't like doing it as much as other people, and so they just go to the phone to get the answer, which isn't really necessarily irrational. Even they do get the answer to the thing. So anyway, so there was a framing around this that was a little bit not really in line with what we were trying to conclude from the paper. And I was interviewed for grad school for this, during grad school, and we were trying to kind of explain what the research actually said. The questions weren't really that leading, but I think there was more kind of explanation of complicated things that weren't really getting the message across very well. And of course, I was far more nervous, and so I don't think it was a very good interview. But the way that I dealt with that is, I learned from it, but also I just forgot about it. That's how I deal with it, in the same way I deal with anything else, just pretend it didn't happen and move on with my life. So and I think that's actually an important point. You think when you're doing these interviews, it is a lot of, it could be a lot of people listening to you at that very moment, but it's not, it's like a few minutes maybe of their lives. They're these are flash in the pan situations that no one's going to remember if you had a bad interview. It's it's not that big of a deal. So you just move on from it and try again. You know what I mean? I think it's the same way as writing a paper. You might spend a lot of time doing research and writing something up that doesn't get cited and hardly anybody reads it. It's well, it's hard to know which ones are going to hit, which ones aren't, and so you just keep on trying until you can actually make an impact. And so that's my basic stance on it. I also have a general kind of easygoing attitude, so that helps when it comes to this sort of thing.
Yeah, you're right. You can do a bad interview, but it's not the end of the world usually. The other thing, if you feel that a reporter has misrepresented your work or misunderstood something you're talking about, we can always go back to the media and try to correct it. So if you feel that that's an issue you've run into, I certainly encourage you to contact myself or Paul, and we can discuss maybe a way to correct it. Again, we're not going to correct every little mistake they made, because they make a lot of little mistakes, but something large that impacts your work, we would certainly look at trying to correct the information. One of the points I'd like to make about media interviews is most of the time, especially for research interviews, they're not looking for controversy. They're looking for the best way to explain your research. So they're not coming at you with a negative approach. In my experience, for the most part, they're just trying to understand what your research is about and how they can explain it. However, if there is a reporter that you feel may be coming at you with a more negative approach, I would encourage you to contact me or Paul as well. If you feel that there's questions that you may be uncomfortable answering, we can help develop responses with you. We can reach out to the reporters and ask exactly what areas they're interested in discussing. They won't tell us the specific questions usually, but they will tell us what areas. And so then we can help you prepare responses to those. I think I'll leave it there. So any other advice you have on dealing with media you'd like to share?
So while relating to that, actually, I was thinking about it. I mean, in my experience, certainly in interviews, I haven't had a case where I really felt that my research was being misrepresented or misunderstood. And, only the cases where, I mean, if they reach out, if they're doing enough to reach out to you to speak on it, then they've already done more research than you find in a lot of cases. The cases where I wouldn't have, I guess the more negative cases where my research was covered in the media were ones where I think we didn't do a very good job framing what the research was about, and it was misunderstood. It wasn't no nefarious purposes there. I mean, I think we need to appreciate that people in the media are they have a very similar job to us as researchers. They just are trying to figure out what's true in the world and communicate to others. They work on very different constraints, though. Of course, they have to get it out rapidly, and they don't have the luxury of going slow and being careful with it as we are. And they're speaking on things, or at least communicating things that they might not have particular expertise in. And so that's why they are talking to us, because they need someone with actual expertise, which makes it really important for us to actually engage, because the story might get written anyways, and so if you don't actually engage, it won't be as accurate. One other thing I was going to say about advice on dealing with the media is, I mean, despite everything that we've just said here, you don't always have to say yes. Right? You might have things going on or whatever, or you might not have that much to say, or maybe somebody who could speak on it, whose voice isn't heard as much as yours, or that might have a different angle on it, that you could recommend in your stead. And so that's something to keep in mind as well. I don't know that I take my own advice very well, but I think it's important advice nonetheless.
Thanks so much for sharing your insights with us today, Gord. I think you've provided a lot of key points that we can use when preparing for media interviews. I think now we'll just turn it over to the audience for questions for Gord, or for Paul, myself, or for Krista. Paul, would you take over?
Sure. Actually, Alec Kouros was making a couple of comments in the chat, and I know, Alec, do you mind turning your video and audio on and sharing a couple of your comments and questions, because you too are a researcher that engages with media a lot.
Sure, I'm happy to. Oops. Here we go. Happy to share a little bit. Do you have any specific questions, Paul?
I would be curious to hear about the backlash part. I haven't fortunately had much for what I've for what I've said. I get emails here and there, but yeah.
Well, I cover some overlapping information, obviously not from an information literacy perspective rather than a psychological perspective. And so I do cover some issues on fake news. I remember just this past summer asking, I think I used a term in an interview like crackpot or something like that, and it wasn't used in the way that it was actually ended up in the news, and it wasn't to describe people who don't believe in vaccines and that sort of thing. It was used in a sort of a colloquial way, sort of indirectly, and not to a particular population, but it ended up in the headline. And then, so I saw a lot of, negative comments. I ended up with some physical mail in my U of R mailbox, for instance, one that was a little bit threatening, for instance, and of course a lot of Twitter backlash and that sort of thing. But I put myself out there openly, as well. That happens a little bit, but there are more people online that will focus on the positives. I think of most stories. Much of the backlash comes from Twitter accounts with 0 followers or 3 followers that were just created the week before, and so typically I take the advice not to feed the trolls and try to keep things fairly civil online. And if anyone wants to see a great model of someone who handles sort of critique online, it would be Dr. Mark Spooner. He's always has a way of making things quite positive in his interactions online, even if he's faced with some hateful commentary. But I guess the bigger question is, as white cisgendered male, full professor, I can certainly react to these and take some of the vitriol more than some of my colleagues can. And I think it's, we have to think about our privilege and our ability to sustain some of the abuse online and take it. Depending on the topic, some of our colleagues might be less encouraged to take up some of these topics because they will see even more hate and a different type of hate, misogyny, etc., online. So we have to always be understanding of that. And I'm not saying that, and I'm not taking this at all or trying to put a negative light on the press. I think everything you said, Gord, about the obligation for professors to take the research and to serve it to the public, to teach, as you mentioned, I think those are really incredibly important ideas. And I think, I live and stand by those. But at the same time, the part of the public will see things differently and push back. And we also have to be ready for those types of stories as well. So that's all I guess I would share on that.
Yeah, I had, by the way, I had a recent, just to speak on the topic also. So, I mean, this is, for many people, this just won't be relevant. If you're not doing research that's controversial, then you're not going to,
right,
also going to come after you. But in our case, it is. There was a professor at NYU that I know, Jay Van Babel, and there was this, it's a bit of a longer story, but there's a person who used a psychological term that has no real basis and is not in the field, and then this professor at NYU was quoted by a fact checker saying that it's not a real thing. And then there was an article in a journal called The Post Millennial, which is a partisan website that's of ill repute, targeting the professor. And then there was a person on Twitter called Jack Posobiec, who's a right-wing person who tries to sow fear and division and so on. And he was also targeting this professor. And so the professor, Dave Van Babel, had to he closed his account so that he wasn't being attacked so much. And then so I decided I would, try to defend him. And I made a Twitter thread myself talking about how egregious this is and there's no scientific basis for it. And I haven't seen anything about it and whatever. And then the same guy, Jack Posobiec, the Twitter, rage inducer, he called me an idiot and he targeted me for a while on Twitter, so I got a bunch of DMs, or not DMs, but people were writing tweets against my thread or whatever. But what I found from it, I mean, this is also, as Alex said, comes from a place of privilege, is that, they comes very quickly. You get this backlash, but it fades just as quickly. They move on within a couple of days onto the next thing that induces outrage, and then you can move on with your life. In my case, it's very, I don't have to open Twitter that day if I didn't want to. And so it comes from a place of privilege. You have to keep that in mind. But often I think that we need to keep in mind that the weight that you feel from the negative, the negative interactions, maybe not as much as it actually is. These are not people acting genuinely in the world. And so we have to keep that kind of in mind when we're dealing with trolls on the internet and so on.
Yeah, I think those are both really good points, is that you may do a great interview and not have any issues with the interview, but maybe some of the audience that's receiving your messages are not that appreciative and may lash out at you. Social media is, we could do a whole another session just on social media. And I think unless you're getting threatened or feel the abuse is getting too much, I think, like Gord said, don't sign into Twitter that day, or just to try to ignore it. Don't take it personally. If you do feel that it's getting out of hand, then there are things we can provide advice on how you might want to try to deal with it. Paul, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Right. I'll just mention, Everett, that you're right. We could do a whole section on social media use. Maybe we will. But I will say about social media is having a presence and a profile on social does get you known to media. Media notice researchers, faculty members that are have an active social media presence, and so you can expect media to approach you on topics that are relevant to your research area. All right, let's move on to Emily. I think I'm tracking. I'll remind you, you can raise your hand or you can put your question in the chat and we'll get to you. Emily, can you expand on your question a little bit? I'm not entirely sure what you mean by if your research focuses on a population that can be controversial. How do you get the media to focus on the research, not the controversy?
Right, so I'm with Canadian Institute for Public Safety Research and Treatment. Not actually a researcher, but I'm actually their knowledge translation specialist. So we deal with public safety populations, which of course include police, paramedics, firefighters, etc. And we've found a little bit of backlash since the defund the police movement. Sometimes when we're posting information about police mental health or public safety mental health. And so our researchers, thankfully, I don't think have faced as much like problems in the media, but it is an issue that we'll continue to face. So I'm just wondering how, when we post about it or even on social media, how we kind of control that messaging to keep it focused on the research, not on the controversy around that population.
Should I answer that?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. That's a super great question. Actually, I think that relates sort of to what we were mentioning. If they're asking you the wrong sort of question, you answer the one that you want to answer. You refocus, and that's actually one really good reason to do the interview, is to try to bring the focus back on what the evidence is and what the research is saying, and so on, and try to refocus things. It may prove difficult depending on what's going on. It hasn't really occurred in my case, and I haven't had to do that, but I think that's an important point. I mean, when it comes to answering questions that would go into like a print story, it's a bit more difficult because you can bring the entire story. But when it comes to an actual media interview, that would be my suggestion. I don't know if that is that a satisfactory answer?
That's good to know. Yep.
Yeah. Is that okay?
Thank you.
Scrolling through here. Bonnie, you've made a couple of comments. Do you have a question for us? Bonnie's Inc.
By the way, there's a question here about Twitter versus like what platform to use to gain exposure. Twitter, I think, was much easier and it's more common for academics. Yeah.
Well, I'm a KT specialist. I've worked in this industry for quite some time, and I have built specific expertise with social media. So I did see a question that interests me that just went by. I think it was Kirsten who asked, where are they? Like, which ones are best? Facebook, Twitter, whatever. So as a former media person and a current user of the media type person, I will say that they are wherever your audience is. So if you use Twitter a lot, most of them are on Twitter. Also, most media are on Facebook. Also, there's some media who hook up to social media specifically for academics, right? So by understanding who your audience is, that will help you go to where you need to be. However, don't be everywhere. You can't split your brain in that many different ways. So just find out what works for you. And there's people out there who have, who are very successful. I will give you an example. When I first moved to Saskatoon, I didn't know anybody. I'm a knitter, so I started a knitting group. I'm also have a degree in political science, so that interests me. We invited one year all of the local MPs to our knitting table to talk to over like 25 knitters that gathered in this knitting group. So that was one way. We reached out from Twitter, and we also have a Facebook page, so we reached out that way. And most of them came, and we actually had a few media that came as well. So, you know, you just figure out where your audience is and go from there.
That's great advice. By the way, you might appreciate.
I see the Bernie. I
Yeah,
see the Bernie.
It's crocheted. But
Yeah, he's crocheted.
yeah, it's crocheted. Yeah.
Who made that for you?
My wife did.
Oh, she's very talented.
Yes, she's very good at it.
All right. One quick comment. Yes, I've scrolled through a lot of, reaching the right audiences on the right platform. And I can say that journalists are all about Twitter. Twitter caters to sort of journalists, activists, advocates, political junkies, those kinds of things. So yeah, if you want to get the attention of media, Twitter is probably the place to be. And then there was a question about LinkedIn, and I know it's a good sort of professional space where you're more likely to engage with peer audiences, but I honestly do not have a ton of experience with LinkedIn. Does anybody have any suggestions or insight into reaching media and connecting with media via LinkedIn?
I certainly don't. I don't use LinkedIn, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nor do I. We certainly don't use it for that purpose, although we certainly tell university stories through our institutional LinkedIn account. But okay. There was one other question. Sorry, I'm losing track here. Alec, do you want to talk about proofing the story before it goes live? That's interesting. Most media organizations will not agree to that. They may let you take a look at the final version of the story, and I assume we're talking about a print story generally as opposed to broadcast. They may allow you an advance preview of it, but most of them will not take editorial input from the subjects that they're speaking to.
In my experience, if you have a relationship with the journalist, they might send you a copy.
Maybe.
I've even had the audio recordings if there was misrepresentation sent. In some cases, but I think it's about trust and relationship with certain journalists over time, and which ones. Like there are certain journalists who perhaps appeal more to the clickbait articles. So I find even the article, the titles can be misrepresentative, and sometimes the story is totally fine, but the title can be a little bit different, and it's quite steered it towards the clickbait article. And so that's where I often find the problem. So even just knowing what the title of the story might be could be helpful in some cases. Although they may or may not want to change it, but at least you have an opportunity to at least to reduce any ambiguation or ambiguity in the story, I guess.
You can certainly ask. There's no harm in that, and some journalists will give you an advance copy. Some may even accept some editorial input. So certainly if you want to do that, you can. I would like to pick up on what you mentioned about recording your side of the interview. We highly recommend that, if you're conducting an interview and there is some potential for controversy or conflict, record it at your end so that you have a record of exactly what you said and the context within which it was said. We often do that in our media relations unit when we're facilitating interviews for our administrators, just to make sure that the final product matches what the interview was truly about.
Yeah, I was actually going to show you an example of if it's of use to others, how I do that. This works well because I teach distance classes as well, but can you see this? So I actually have a full mixer board. I've got microphones up here, so I can connect a phone directly, and this allows me to record some of what I'd like to record, I guess. So when I'm speaking, I'm actually speaking through a mixer board, through a professional mic. I mean, obviously, none of this is necessary, but it's good to have your side or the telephone record your side, so you actually have a copy of what you said.
And for those of us who aren't that equipped, your voice memo function on your phone works well as well. You can record your end or be on speakerphone and record both ends of it.
Well, another option that doesn't really require too much technology is just to, at the end of the interview, you can provide the reporter with a way to contact you directly, so they can clarify any information they may not be sure of, and that's just give them your phone number or an email that you'll be monitoring for the next hour or two, so that if they have any questions, they can get a hold of you.
That's a great point by Gabriella in the chat too. Yeah.
I agree. Gabriella, do you want to expand on that? We have a few minutes left here, I think. I'm intrigued by it as well, because you know what? The final product after you engage with media is maybe not always quite exactly what we wanted it to be, but it can be a really good learning experience for, you know, if you frame it that way for journalists who are usually receptive to adjusting language, you know, based on sort of what you've described here. I mean, again, it goes back to what Everett said. You know, most journalists don't have a hidden agenda. If they're setting up a story as two-sided or conflicting, they'll certainly make you aware of that, and you can sort of react and respond and go through the interview accordingly. But really, they're not hostile most times. They're not out to get you most times, and most mistakes or errors are innocent, I would say. I don't know, Gord, do you agree with that?
For sure, yeah.
Yeah, so if you want, I can talk about an experience. It was about harm reduction and alcohol use, and it was about a project that we did with community members. And after the interview, the headlines were, the words that they were using was booze and junkies and things like that. And actually, I reached out and I said that I know that I never used those words, and they said yes, that was our, like that's how we worked with the material and things like that. And I explained them that there is a responsibility in forming how society talks about people when they read and they normalize certain terminology. So, and actually, I think they change. I asked them whether they can change the headline and not to have that terminology in there, and they did. It was online, and that was a good experience. And now I'm trying to be proactive. So I would say I intentionally describe people who use drugs this way, and I would like you to quote me exactly using this terminology. Yeah, thanks.
I like that advice, Gabriella. It's when you say proactive, actually, that might be a good way to kind of finish here. You know, you have rights to establish boundaries and parameters when you're engaging with the media, right? You may want to make something like that very clear, that we want to ensure that improper labels aren't being used or outdated labels aren't being used. Or you may want to say, as Everett pointed out, can you provide me with your area of questioning? Or you may want to ask, within what context is this interview, you know, is this story going to be built and written? You're allowed to be somewhat proactive when engaging with the media. It's not all sort of reacting to their questions and how they want to approach the story necessarily, and you should seize the opportunity to educate them as well. So, and we can assist if you have questions or you're unsure or you're sensing something's not quite right, then you can engage with us, and we can hopefully assist you a little bit in finding comfortable ground to engage the media on.
I just want to jump in and say one thing about that being proactive. Like, I've learned so much from our researchers who are doing cutting edge work, who are reading the materials as it's coming out, who are writing these materials as it's coming out. And so that kind of language for reporters isn't also, you know, because reporters don't care or don't know. It's just same as me in the position I'm in. I'm learning a lot from you. And Gabrielle, I remember when you and I first worked together, I changed language I was using based on us working together. So, you know, there is some benefit of the doubt, and being proactive and going back to reporters is they're often receptive for things like that, for sure.
All right, I think Andrea has put some information into the chat as well about posting the recording for this. We will be collecting and putting together a bit of a research, a media engagement package, and we will be putting it on URSource. We will, of course, get the word out to our research community when we have that material up, which will include the recordings of these sessions. Look forward to the Conversation Canada session, which we're in the process of organizing and scheduling. And I feel like I learned that maybe we need a social media session here too, but we'll take that away and discuss that. Thank you for everyone for participating in our wide-ranging conversation today, especially to Gord Pennycook and Alec Kuros and others. We welcome your feedback on this session, how it could be improved, what we might have missed, if there were any gaps, how we can do it better next time we deliver it. And that's it, except if you have a research story to tell, please reach out to our unit and we will do the best that we can to help out. Thanks very much, everybody, for participating today.
Thanks again, Paul.